Good evening, everyone. The past few modules, hopefully you've learned from the readings how Robert E. Lee has maintained the front line, beaten multiple Union generals, and kept the Army of Northern Virginia intact. However, a new general comes east in the spring of 1864 under Abraham Lincoln, who finally finds his general out west in defeating Confederate armies at Vicksburg and Chattanooga. That is Ulysses S. Grant. He is now asking him to take on the biggest task of his career, which is to defeat the Eastern Giant, Robert E. Lee. However, this campaign that these two great generals are going to fight will be the turning point in the war. And we're going to assess how Ulysses S. Grant was able to overcome so many casualties. We are going to analyze his decisions that he makes throughout the Overland campaign, which is going to shape not just this campaign, but how it's going to shape the rest of the war and lead to the surrender of Robert E. Lee. So Ulysses Grant is going to undertake the Overland route. From the past module, you should have read about how Grant planned this great strategic movement across the whole Confederacy, and that the Overland campaign was not his first choice. Unfortunately, Halleck forced Grant to take this route due to political and public necessity. He would have much rather gone on the North Carolina expedition. So this map on the right represents the route in which the Army of the Potomac took in order to defeat Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. Keep in mind, Richmond is not his goal. Okay, Robert E. Lee's army is his goal. So he is going to implement continuous contact throughout the entire campaign. He wants to put pressure on his Confederate foe. And then, of course, this picture on the left is the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. So this first battle that both Grant and Lee are going to fight is at the Battle of the Wilderness. And here, Grant finally proves to the Army of the Potomac that he is meant to lead this army. He is going to order multiple attacks against the Army of Northern Virginia, despite the dense wilderness in this region. He is going to hold his position. At one point, there is a Confederate flank attack against Sedgwick's 6th Corps. Grant's headquarters will be fired upon, but Grant will just simply order artillery should be brought up in case they get close enough. Ultimately, the Confederate forces stop, but Grant remains calm and stays in place. The Confederates fail to cut off his supply routes, and therefore Grant sees no reason in retreating. Nonetheless, he is going to lose roughly 18,000 soldiers to Robert E. Lee's 11,125. They lose roughly the same percentage here, but ultimately it will be a bloody battle. Lee's army will be flanked, Grant's armies will be flanked. Lee will attempt to launch a counterattack that almost breaks Hancock's 2nd Corps, but it fails. And ultimately, Grant will decide that hostilities here cannot continue. It will only lead to more bloodletting. And he decides to turn Lee's flank and head to Spotsylvania Courthouse. So despite the high casualties, Grant's position in the wilderness was not hazardous enough for him to actually retreat. General Joseph Hooker lost his nerve roughly a year before during the Battle of Chancellorsville. And he did retreat. Grant did not, which will lead them to the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. And the pictures that you're seeing on the screen of the leaves and maybe an indentation are old Union trenches. Because Grant is continuously pressing Confederate forces, that will require breastworks, entrenchments to protect themselves from fire. But he wants to put as much pressure on the Confederates as possible. And this isn't necessarily going to lead in attrition or loss of manpower to the Confederates, but rather it's going to actually hurt Lee's health more than anything, which we'll discuss later. This bottom right image is actually the Confederate salient in which Grant ordered a Union assault to take place. And they will successfully break that salient on May 12th, 1864. Grant knew or learned that that salient was a position of weakness and learned from previous failed assaults that this was the place they needed to attack. Even though Robert E. Lee would retreat back and set up a more defensive position against Grant's Army of the Potomac, Grant did not launch needless assaults against Lee's army. Rather, he sought to maneuver and probe Lee's front to figure out where a weak spot may be. And unfortunately, he didn't find it. And even more significantly, Grant's strategy began to fall apart, at least in Virginia, with General Franz Sigel defeated in the Shenandoah Valley, and then General Benjamin Butler was, quote unquote, bottled up in the James River Peninsula. So Grant already foresaw that any continued hostilities at Spotsylvania would be fruitless and would only allow for more bloodshed. Keep in mind, Grant's losses here are going to be 18,500. Lee's losses here are going to be probably closer to around 13,000. Okay, most of those losses come from that assault on the Muleshoe, which tactically speaking, it was a huge Union success. And Grant was concerned Lee was going to retreat. But it was Lee that he was facing, not Pemberton, not Bragg, and certainly not Polk. So ultimately, there is a lull in the campaign as Grant once again launches a flanking maneuver, or he decided to turn Lee's flank. And as Grant withdraws from Spotsylvania Courthouse, it forces Lee to react as it forced him to react at the Wilderness. He has to also maneuver out from Spotsylvania in order to get between Grant and Richmond because he cannot let Grant take Richmond. However, Lee did not understand that the Army of Northern Virginia was the objective and not Richmond. So here, if you look on the left, that is actually a home near the North Anna River that Lee sat on, drinking honey milk because he was suffering from dysentery due to the stress of the campaign. And he will just be sitting a few feet away from a Union cannonball striking the home, and more artillery will fire upon this position and destroy the brick fireplace on the left side of the building, which will actually kill one of Lee's aides. So once again, Lee is going to have to become a crisis manager and make sure his army is not destroyed, because at the North Anna River, the Army of the Potomac will find success at Jericho Mills, and they will hold an important crossing further south. which left the position of Ox Ford in Confederate hands, and it was now the center of gravity or an important point for Grant to take. However, this is where the brilliance of Lee comes out, and he sets up an inverted V with the apex of that V on Ox Ford, where the river meets that point. What this did is it actually divided Grant's army, because at this point in the campaign, Grant's army consisted of 67,000 soldiers, while the Army of Northern Virginia had 52,000 soldiers. So hardly 2-to-1 odds here. And this forces Grant to reevaluate the situation. He realizes his army is divided and he cannot successfully attack, probe, or outmaneuver Lee's army. So with much fewer loss of life, Grant once again decides on a turning movement. It should be said that later on and after the war that Lee was planning an attack against one separated portion of Grant's army. However, there have been many historians like Dr. Grimsley, as well as Dr. Esposito, who have said that the Union Army was too well entrenched for that assault to be successful. And finally, we arrive at Totopotomoy Creek. Try saying that 10 times fast. And here the Union Army begins to probe and find more tactical success against the Confederate force at places like Hawes Shop, and then ultimately Grant will order Sheridan to hold the old Cold Harbor Crossroads, which he successfully will. And this will be a 9-mile front, covering a lot of ground. After Sheridan repels multiple Confederate attacks against his position, the road to Richmond is now available to Grant. So he maneuvers 6 corps, which at this point in time is now Horatio Wright's after Sedgwick was killed at Spotsylvania Courthouse. And he's also ordered up the Army of the James from the James River Peninsula, since they were now bottled up. And they arrived here at Cold Harbor. They had some success on June 1st. They did break through. And ultimately, this is what Grant planned to attack Confederate forces the next day on June 2nd. So he maneuvered Hancock's 2nd Corps down south to Cold Harbor to prepare them to assault this last Confederate line. The Confederates only had 1 reserve. It looked promising. The campaign was supposed to end here. Up to this point in time, Grant has forced Lee out from the trenches. He has forced him 80 miles south of the initial front line after just a month of fighting, but at a huge cost. And it was here that Grant wanted to make up for that and show the public that he was not just the right general, but he was the right general to end this extremely bloody war. Unfortunately, it would not come to be, as Union forces launched an attack against a very heavily fortified Confederate position in which they lost 3,500 soldiers in roughly 6 hours. And there's a lot of mythology behind that. Some say they lost, 7,000 in 30 minutes or whatever it may be, but that's just not true. Throughout the entire day, on the entire 9-mile front, the Union Army lost roughly 6,000 soldiers. They actually had much more success on the Union right, as Cavalry General James Wilson found success at the Second Battle of Hawes Shop, and Burnside was able to retake the Shady Grove Road. Now, between June 4th to June 12th, Grant will determine to push to the city of Petersburg, which was the lifeblood of the Army of Northern Virginia. That's where they received supplies, food, from places like Wilmington, North Carolina, as well as further south in places like Mobile. And this is what Grant wanted to cut off. He didn't want to take the city, he didn't want to take the position, but he wanted to absolve or negate Lee's fighting ability. And this would do that, exactly that. So Grant successfully actually, once again, goes on, he turned the Army of Northern Virginia's right by crossing the James River Peninsula without detection, and he arrives at Petersburg, and there is an opportunity to take Petersburg on both June 15th and June 16th. But Lee's army will eventually figure out pretty quickly that Grant is not here. I don't know where he is. Oh, it looks like he's in Petersburg. Let's go to Petersburg. And unfortunately, the Union Army will have to settle for a quasi siege. So where does all of this leave us? Who won the Overland campaign? Why is this of any importance whatsoever? Oh, and as you can see here, you can actually see Petersburg on this map. You can look at all the trenches that were built, all the various forts that were needed for Grant's continuous contact. So what's the significance of this? Why do we continue to debate about who won the Overland campaign? Why is it so important? Well, the significance is exactly this. Grant was able to take away the initiative from Lee, which no general had ever done before. Lee continued to respond to Grant's movements throughout the campaign, and he will continue to do so throughout the rest of the war. Lee will not find any operational or strategic success for the rest of the war. Grant further also pushed the front line, and only a month just south of Richmond, and it will be the Richmond-Petersburg siege. His army traveled 80 miles in that 1 month. So it was a campaign of maneuver rather than one of attrition. However, attrition did play an important factor in this. The stress, the continuous fighting caught up to Lee. It actually made him sick with dysentery, and this is something he's going to suffer from the Battle of North Anna all the way down to Petersburg. The Confederate Officer Corps, James Longstreet's going to be wounded in the Wilderness. A.P. Hill is going to suffer from illness. Richard Ewell is actually going to be briefly relieved of command after his failure at Spotsylvania Courthouse. All of these reasons contribute to Grant's success during the Overland campaign, and Grant will be that much closer to final victory in capturing Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse. And while there will be a 9-month protracted siege, Lee will be unable to assist any other theaters of war during this time. He cannot send soldiers down to Atlanta to help Confederate forces fight William T. Sherman. All of this is the reason why Abraham Lincoln brought Ulysses S. Grant east. Thank you.